Chapter 8. Working Conditions on the Job and at Home. Finding work, enduring long hours, and the uncertainty of keeping a steady income dominated the lives of many, and perhaps most of the working class. Whether on the farm or the sea, or in the factory, the forest, or the mine, ever present for many workers was the possibility of injury, either immediate and possibly fatal, or the gradual, insidious, work-linked lung and other diseases. Those who worked most closely with the natural world, especially farmers, ranchers, fishermen, and loggers, also had to contend with the vagaries of rain, drought, sea changes, forest fires, and technological shifts that could wipe them out economically, for a season or forever. Harvey Green, 2000. Introduction. Improvements in the standard of living are usually measured by increases in consumption per person over time. This book broadens the concept of consumption, using Gary Becker's theory of time use that views consumer welfare as a joint product of market-purchased goods and services and household-provided time. This framework emphasizes the parallels between home production and market production and adjusts GDP to include products produced in the home, whether a home-produced woman's dress in the 1870s or a home-baked cake in the 1950s. In recent decades, analysts have attempted to go further by measuring the value of consumer surplus when new products are introduced, and considerations of the value of declining mortality and increasing life expectancy, as in the previous chapter, create the biggest gains of all. This chapter extends the concept of the standard of living to include conditions of work both outside and inside the home. In 1870, more than 80% of the labor force worked at jobs that were hazardous, tedious, and unpleasant. Farmers and farm laborers were subject to droughts, blizzards, floods, and insects because their work occurred outdoors. Blue-collar craftsmen, operatives, and laborers were exposed to working conditions that were often dangerous or unsanitary, as in the heat of a steel mill, injury-prone work on the railroads, or the filth and stench of the stockyards. The transition between 1870 and 1940 and beyond gradually reduced the ratio of jobs that were arduous to those that were less taxing, and in which the economists' concept of the disutility of work was markedly lower. The rising share of clerks, salespeople, managers, and professionals made the working hours, if not delightful fun, at least less physically taxing than before. And those working hours steadily declined, from a typical 60-hour work week in 1900 to a typical 40-hour week after 1940. The chapter begins by describing changes in the average work experience of Americans. Labor force participation of adult males declined even as that of females increased. As more people lived beyond age 65 thanks to increasing life expectancy, the concept of retirement was invented. For the few males who survived past age 65 in 1870, the male labor force participation rate in the age group 65 to 75 was an astonishing 88%, and as life expectancy was extended, the transformation of life at ages older than 65 took on new importance. The percentage of the population living past their 65th birthday was only 34% in 1870, but jumped to 56% in 1940, and then to 77% in 2000. Just as old age was transformed, so was youth. In 1880, time spent in full-time education dropped off rapidly after age 12, and few young people went to high school. An astonishing 50% of boys aged 14 and 15 were in the labor force. But child labor almost vanished by 1940, as high school education reached an ever-growing share of the population. As in other dimensions of life, female differences were much greater before 1940 than after. It was much less likely for 14 to 15-year-old girls than boys to participate in market work. But they were heavily engaged in home production, working as partners with their mothers in performing the many tedious tasks required to run the household. As we learned in Chapter 3, most clothing for women and children was made at home, from store-bought dry goods, and the daughters were fully engaged with the mother in making clothing for the family. The improvements in working conditions over time reflects both the changing mix of occupations away from those that were most unpleasant and hazardous and, just as important, improved working conditions within the major occupational groups. No occupation was transformed more completely by 1940 than farming, as crude, early horse-drawn plows of the 1870s were replaced by gas-powered machines after 1910, especially the ubiquitous tractor. In manufacturing, workers became more independent, as electric-powered floor-mounted and hand tools replaced centralized, steam-powered distributed inefficiently by rubber and leather belts. The iron and steel industry after 1870 gradually eliminated hot and dangerous jobs. Hideous conditions in meatpacking and other food-related industries were substantially improved during the progressive era of 1900 to 1920. Sweatshops producing apparel in appalling conditions attracted the searchlight of public opinion after the catastrophic New York Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, a precursor of the deadly conditions in Bangladesh apparel factories revealed in recent years. A consistent theme of working life before 1940 was its insecurity, including not only the risk of cyclical unemployment, but also of arbitrary dismissals when a firm fired an employee who was no longer capable of doing brute force labor, as well as the risk of seasonal or firm-specific plant shutdowns that left the worker before 1940 without any income at all. This chapter also treats education in its multiple roles of eliminating child labor, making the life of teenagers more enjoyable, and contributing directly to economic growth. The achievement of local, state, and federal government in funding the rise of educational attainment is discussed in this chapter, and other contributions of all levels of government to growth and productivity and the standard of living are among the topics in the next chapter. More labor force participation for women, less for teens and the elderly. The historical trends in labor force participation for adults are among the most familiar data in labor economics, and they reveal a great deal about the nature of the workforce from year to year. As shown in Figure 8.1, there was a historic transformation in the participation of adult, aged 25 to 64, women, changing gradually from 12% to 26% between 1870 and 1940, then surging from 32% in 1950 to 72% in 2000. Despite the widespread impression that the entry of women was a one-time process after the women's liberation movement of the late 1960s, it actually evolved more gradually. The only decade during which female participation declined was between 1910 and 1920. The average increase in the female participation rate was 2.2 points per decade between 1880 and 1940, compared to 6.5 points per decade during 1940 to 2010. From 1890 to 1980, participation among women increased in all age groups, but that for young women in the 25 to 34 age group increased more gradually than for older women in the 45 to 54 age group. The causes of the gradual increase in female participation before World War II and the more rapid increase thereafter combined higher supply caused by the time saving made possible by modern home appliances, and higher demand as employment increased in the occupations that favored women, including clerical and sales jobs, as well as nursing and school teaching. The participation rate of males aged 25 to 64 held steady at more than 95% during the 1870 to 1940 interval covered by this chapter, declining only by 0.4 percentage points per decade. In Part 2 of the book, Chapter 15, we will note the accelerated decline in prime age male participation after 1970. Participation rates for youth reflect expanding educational opportunities and the end of the scourge of child labor. Figure 8.2 displays participation rates by sex for the 10 to 15 and 14 to 15 age groups. In 1880, a startling 30% of boys aged 10 to 15 worked in the labor force, as did an even higher 50% of boys aged 14 to 15. Because these percentages reflect paid employment and exclude unpaid work by teenagers in farm families, the true participation rate of teenagers in the late 19th century must have been substantially higher. The male participation rate for ages 14 to 15 declined sharply, from 42% in 1910 to 10% in 1940, coinciding with the period of the greatest rate of increase in high school attendance. Figure 8.2 shows that participation rates for teenage girls were less than half that of males in each age group, and at each point of time. The participation rate for girls aged 14 to 15 reached a maximum of 20% in 1910, and by 1940 had declined to 4%. Though participation in market work was much less important for teenage girls than for boys, the difference is nevertheless probably reversed when household work is considered. In the late 19th century, day-by-day household work was exceedingly onerous by modern standards, and teenage girls were called upon to be assistant mothers in every aspect of home production, from hauling water to laundry to kitchen tasks to making clothes and caring for young children. When we examine the participation rates of older teenagers and youth as in Figure 8.3, which covers the 16 to 24 age group, again we see a great disparity between the sexes before 1940. This narrows gradually, but most of the convergence occurred between 1960 and 1990. For young males, the participation rate declined from 87% in 1910 to 63% in 1970, followed by a brief reversal in the 1970s. Most, if not all, the decline in young male participation reflected the spread of high school education before World War II and the rising share of those attending college after World War II. For males, the decline in youth participation is paralleled by an even sharper decline in participation of those aged 65 to 74, as shown in Figure 8.4. In the early years, thanks to low life expectancy, this was a relatively small group, but it increased as a percentage of the population as life expectancy increased. From today's perspective, it seems surprising that in 1870, fully 88% of males in the 65 to 74 age group worked in the labor force. Why? They had little choice. There was no Social Security until the late 1930s, and private pension plans for farm and manual urban workers hardly existed. Because few females had jobs, the only choice for elderly men was to continue working until sickness, disability, or death made that impossible. A blunt summary might say that they worked until they dropped. That 88% elderly male participation rate in 1870 raises interesting questions. We first need some perspective. In 1870, only 25% of Americans lived in urban areas. Such high participation of the elderly could reflect rural life in the 1870s. Grandfathers helped out with family chores on the farm or in the family-owned general store. In urban settings, the elderly men may have worked not at back-breaking construction or manufacturing work, but as helpers in retail and service establishments, analogous to today's elderly greeters at Walmarts. Male participation in the 65 to 74 age group declined from 88% in 1870 to 53% in 1940 to 24% in 1990. There was no similar decline in elderly female participation, which was at or slightly below 10% between 1870 and 1940, and only a bit above 10% from 1940 to 2010. In any case, it is clear that the phenomenon of retirement for males aged 65 or older began long before the New Deal's invention of Social Security. The three big themes that emerge from this section are 1. A gradual movement toward equality for women in the rate of participation in the labor market. 2. The rise of education and the disappearance of child labor. And 3. The absence of the institution of retirement for elderly men in the late 19th century and the gradual transition to the modern world in which labor contracts and pension plans freed men, and now women, to make a transition into leisure in their 60s. Work. Taxing, tedious, dangerous, and unstable. The unpleasantness, economists call this the disutility, of work declined sharply over the past 14 decades. Though improvements in household production made possible by consumer appliances have long been an important topic in the history of economic growth, there has been less attention to the declining unpleasantness of work as economic development changed the distribution of occupations and as labor-saving electric-powered and gasoline-powered machinery reduced the difficulty of particular work tasks. How did the relative growth and decline of industries influence the industrial structure of employment? Working conditions were more difficult and arduous in farming, mining, and manufacturing than in most other industries. So a shift in the industry mix of employment away from these industries reduced the disutility of work. For the pre-1940 period, railroad employment should also be treated as unpleasant, owing to the high number of deaths and injuries of railroad employees during the years before 1930. It is more informative to disaggregate employment by occupation rather than by industry, as displayed in Table 8.1, for the terminal years 1870 and 2009 together, with 3 intermediate dates, as 1910, 1940, and 1970. This decomposition allows us to develop a numerical estimate of the share of jobs that were arduous and physically difficult, in contrast to those that were less unpleasant. The ordering of occupations starts with the least desirable at the top and the most rewarding of occupations at the bottom. In line 1, farmers and farm workers declined steadily from 1870 to 1970 to almost vanish by 2009. Between 1870 and 2009, fully 44.8% of the labor force shifted out of agriculture into some other occupation. Blue-collar employment consists of craftsmen, operatives, and laborers, most of whom worked in mining, manufacturing, construction, utilities, transportation, and communication, for example, as telephone repair workers. These occupations increased from 33.5% to 39% between 1870 and 1940, then declined slowly to 1970 and sharply thereafter. Within the blue-collar category, skilled craft workers held their ground, declining only from 11.4% in 1870 to 8.2% in 2009. Operatives, many of whom were assembly line workers in manufacturing, swelled as a percentage from 12.7% in 1870 to 18.2% in 1940, before a long decline to 10.2% in 2009. This shift in the structure of blue-collar employment resulted both from technological change, as robots replaced assembly line workers, and from imports and offshoring that decreased the share of employment in the manufacturing sector from its early post-war peak. Even more striking is the near disappearance of the laborer classification, as the physical tasks of hauling and digging were replaced by motor vehicles and increasingly advanced machinery. Although the share of blue-collar workers did not decline between 1870 and 1970, the share of farming almost vanished, offset by the increasing shares of white-collar and managerial/professional work. We note that within the category of white-collar work in Table 8.1, the category of domestic service workers almost vanished from 7.8% in 1870 to 0.6% in 2009. With the managerial/professional category, there was a substantial decline in the share of proprietors, particularly between 1940 and 1970, whereas there was a multifold increase in the shares of managers and professionals. The largest absolute increase in the share of managers increased after 1970, leading to accusations that American business firms had become overstaffed and bureaucratic. The largest absolute increase in the share of professionals occurred earlier, between 1940 and 1970, and the increase continued at a slower pace after 1970. To some extent, the rising share of professionals mirrored the rising share of employment in the education and health sectors. Also, the growth of the professional category was a natural byproduct of rising college completion rates. A crude way to summarize the transition toward lessened disutility of work is to tally the share of total employees engaged in relatively disagreeable work, whether outside, exposed to the elements, involving heavy lifting or digging, or featuring monotonous repetitive motions on the assembly line. For this purpose, we will include all those engaged in farming, blue-collar work, or domestic service as having unpleasant jobs, and everyone else as having pleasant jobs. This two-way classification does not allow for nuances. For instance, that cashiers in retail stores may have jobs that are as repetitive and boring as those of assembly line workers, whereas some craft workers in manufacturing or construction create objects of which workers can be proud. Nevertheless, the shift in the nature of work since 1870 has been striking, as the share of those in unpleasant occupations declined from an initial 87.2% over the years to 21.6% in 2009. That decline happened fairly steadily, at a rate of about -5 percentage points per decade, with the lowest decline, -3.2, during 1870 to 1910, and the most rapid, -6.8, during 1940 to 70. The story becomes slightly more complex when we shift to a three-way distinction that recognizes two dimensions of unpleasantness: work that is physically difficult and taxing versus jobs that are not physically challenging but rather repetitive and boring. This three-way distinction creates a category of truly disagreeable work, including farming, blue-collar laborers, and domestic servants. The middle category of boring and repetitious includes the jobs of blue-collar craftsmen, operatives, and all service workers other than domestic servants. The third category can be called non-routine cognitive and includes the professional/managerial categories. Taking into account the three-way distinction, the big shift over the century after 1870 was from truly disagreeable jobs mainly to repetitive occupations, leaving room for only a small shift to non-routine cognitive employment. Only after 1970 did the change in the nature of work become unambiguously positive, as non-routine cognitive work gained at the expense of both truly disagreeable and repetitive occupations. The ratio of disagreeable to non-routine cognitive jobs shifted from 7.9 in 1870 to 2.1 in 1940 to 0.1 in 2010. One of the greatest achievements of American economic growth over the past 14 decades. Both the two-way and three-way occupational classifications greatly understate the improvement in working conditions, for they assume that jobs in a given occupation were as taxing, arduous, boring, and/or repetitive in 2009 as they were in 1870. One only need contrast the 1870 farmer pushing a plow behind a horse or mule, exposed to heat, rain, and insects, with the 2009 farmer riding in the air-conditioned cab of his giant John Deere tractor that finds its way across the field by GPS and uses a computer to optimally drop and space the seeds as the farmer reads farm reports and learns about crop prices on a fixed screen or portable tablet. And this dimension of change extended across nearly all occupations. In our case study of iron and steel workers subsequently in this chapter, we see that some of the most uncomfortable and taxing jobs, especially those featuring exposure to extreme heat, had started to disappear as early as 1890. Just as jobs requiring heavy physical labor were phased out, working conditions changed in the repetitive jobs as well, as air conditioning reduced the discomfort of repetitive manufacturing, clerical, and sales jobs. In the post-war period, memory typewriters, mainframe computers, and personal computers eliminated repetitive retyping of documents and manual hand entry of bank statements, telephone bills, and insurance policies. The work week. Fewer hours and fewer days. Regardless of whether a job was physically taxing, in the late 19th century, fatigue was inevitable as a result of long work hours. By 1870, when our story begins, the work week in manufacturing had declined to 10 hours per day, whereas a census survey carried out in 1830 showed that 11 or more hours per day was standard at more than half the establishments surveyed. Massachusetts textile workers continued to work 11.5 to 12 hours per day until an 1874 law mandated no more than 10. In the late 19th century, the typical worker labored 10 hours per day for 6 days per week. By 1920, this had declined to 8 hours per day for 6 days a week, and by 1940, the same number of hours for 5 days per week. The standard 40-hour full-time work week has remained surprisingly stable during the post-war period, 7 decades of stability after such radical change in the century before 1940. The rapid decline in working hours led John Maynard Keynes in 1931 to make a famous prediction that turned out to be quite wrong, that society would be so productive that each worker would only need to work for 15 hours per week. For many ages to come, the old Adam will be so strong in us that everybody will need to do some work if he is to be contented. We shall do more things for ourselves than is usual with the rich today, only too glad to have small duties and tasks and routines, but beyond this we shall endeavor to spread the bread thin on the butter, to make what work there is still to be done to be as widely shared as possible. 3-hour shifts or a 15-hour work week may put off the problem for a great while. Figure 8.5 displays 2 measures of hours of work. The dark gray line exhibits hours per week for production, non-supervisory workers in the private non-agricultural sector. This series declines in stages from about 58.5 hours per week in the 1890s to about 41 hours per week after 1950. The decline starts in 1900, accelerates during the decade of the teens, halts during the 1920s, and then plummets during the Depression years. If we skip over the Great Depression and World War II, we find that hours per week declined from 48.7 to 41.1 between 1929 and 1950, after declining from 58.5 in 1900 to 49.6 in 1923. The alternative series, shown by the white line in Figure 8.5, is the ratio of total hours of work to the number of total employees. This can behave quite differently. Hours per week were shorter for middle-class and upper-class employees, who were not covered by the production worker series. More important, the white line includes agricultural workers, whereas the dark gray line does not. Hence, the white line declines by only about half as much as the dark gray line between 1870 and 1940, because almost half of employment in 1899 was in the farm sector, and agricultural hours were 45.5 hours per week, not the 60 or more common in manufacturing. And the post-war behavior of the 2 series is also quite different. The production worker series reflects the fact that full-time work hours per week have been relatively constant during the post-war years, exhibiting small fluctuations that are mainly cyclical. But the broader hours per employee series declines markedly, particularly between 1950 and 1980. This reflects primarily the entry of women into the labor force and their prevalence in part-time jobs. Also pushing down the ratio of hours worked to employment are longer vacations, more holidays, and more days of sick leave. Like so many features of American progress, from electrification to the rise of the motor vehicle to the eradication of infant mortality, progress in reducing work hours is centered on a short period of human history, 1900 to 1940. Claudia Goldin attributes at least part of the decline in hours during 1910 to 1920 to progressive-era legislation limiting work hours of women and children. Progress in the period since 1940 not only has resulted in a minimal reduction in working hours of regular full-time jobs, but also has been counterproductive by pushing people into part-time jobs against their will, as employers try to escape the expense of pension benefits and medical insurance that in many cases they are not required to pay to part-time employees. In April 2015, fully 6.6 million people held part-time jobs who would have preferred full-time jobs, but were unable to find them. New survey data uncovered by Dora Costa reveals surprisingly little variation, except the top income groups, in hours of work by occupation or by sex. Her large sample across numerous states in the last 2 decades of the 19th century records an average of 10.2 hours per day for men and 9.5 hours for women. Work typically went from 7 a.m. to 5:30 p.m., with a half-hour break for lunch. Virtually all the respondents reported working on Saturday for the same hours as on weekdays. This work effort, of roughly 60 hours per week, is consistent with the time series on production workers displayed in Figure 8.5. The surveys used by Costa refer only to the non-farm economy and do not include farm workers, who worked shorter hours per week over the course of the year, owing to lack of activity during the winter months. Thus, Costa's data provides a further verification of the dark gray line in Figure 8.5 and is not in conflict with the white line based on the entire economy, including farms. Costa's survey evidence indicates that those in the bottom decile of wages in 1890 worked an average of 11 hours per day, whereas those in the top decile worked 9 hours per day. The difference between working class and middle/upper class hours is supported by the 1925 survey of Muncie, Indiana, by Robert and Helen Lind, who found that typical working class daily hours started at 7 a.m., whereas those for the business class typically started by 8:30 a.m. Interpretations of the movement for shorter hours center on the widespread belief on the part of both firms and labor leaders that a reduction in hours would improve work performance and increase production. Higher productivity and higher real wages made possible a gradual reduction of hours of work, for the onerous demands of 60 and 72-hour work weeks had created an exhausted male working class with little or no time to enjoy leisure, nor any time to help their wives with chores at home. As a result of these pressures, worker hours per week declined 4 times as quickly during the first 2 decades of the 20th century as during the last few decades of the 19th century. The reasons why this occurred are complex and controversial. The few industries that were unionized led the way, and railroad employees gained the 8-hour day in 1916 as a result of the first federal government legislation limiting hours. Many states began to pass legislation limiting hours as an offshoot of the Progressive Era. Politicians also led the way, including through the 1912 Bull Moose Platform plank that followed for shorter hours and through Woodrow Wilson's support of an 8-hour day. The American farmer, exposed to volatile weather, eroding soil, and unpredictable farm prices. The occupation of farming depends on the fertility of the land, the weather, and the extent to which animal and mechanical power is available to lighten the burden of the physically difficult work that men had endured for millennia. Our primary focus here is on the fertile Midwest and the Great Plains, to which millions migrated from the eastern states and from abroad. The frontier pushed westward, spurred in part by the 1862 Homestead Act, which offered 160 acres of free land to anyone who would occupy and improve it. Between 1862 and 1913, the federal government granted 2.5 million homestead claims, and 4 million settlers filed claims to 270 million acres in 30 states, 10% of the area of the United States at the time. This encouragement by the federal government pushed the frontier westward into Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. But only about 40% of these claims were finalized. Drought, insect plagues, low farm prices, and isolation caused thousands of farm sites to be abandoned. Immigrants from Europe or from the Northeast were unprepared for the variation in temperature. An early memoir from Kansas reported a temperature of 108 Fahrenheit in the shade. The winds were hot and dry, and the grass, baked on the stem, had become as inflammable as hay. The little gardens withered, and many of the women began to complain bitterly of the loneliness and lack of shade. The tiny cabins were like ovens at midday. Other hazards on the plains included the strong winds of summer and winter, the deep cold in winter blizzards with little protection inside crude cabins, and plagues of insects that climaxed in the 1874 invasion of grasshoppers that ravaged crops from the Dakotas to Texas. Though the ultimate consequences of this overexpansion were not fully realized until the Dust Bowl disaster of 1934–36, the process of debasing the land began in the 1870s. As the original ground cover of the Great Plains, including buffalo grasses, was destroyed by the 1870s slaughter of the buffalo and subsequent grazing of cattle and sheep, it was further degraded by plowing for wheat crops. By the 1930s, virtually the entire Great Plains region suffered from moderate to severe sheet erosion and slight to severe wind erosion. 1,000 tons per square mile were swept away by wind and water. The Mississippi River alone deposited 15 tons of sediment a second into the Gulf of Mexico. Even though the land may initially have been free, there were unavoidable expenses to setting up a farm. The Midwest was not entirely treeless, and in the forests of Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, trees had to be cleared. It has been estimated that a month of labor plus a team of oxen were required to clear an acre. Treeless prairie offered sod that had to be broken, a difficult task owing to the almost impenetrable tangle of roots from millennia of grasses. Estimates of the total expense of setting up a farm vary with its location and size, but one set of estimates ranges from $981 for a 40-acre farm to $3,013 for a 160-acre farm in a year when the average annual wage was about $400. As a result, many potential farmers could not save or borrow enough to own their own farms and became tenants. And in 1900, the share of farms run by tenants ranged from 60% at age 25 to 20% at age 65. No matter whether a farm was located in the dry Great Plains or the most verdant Midwest, or whether the operator was an owner or tenant, the daily routine of farm work varied little from day to day within a given season. But typical activities ranged from season to season. Farm families arose at dawn. Then the father and the male children headed outdoors before breakfast to feed animals, milk cows, and collect eggs. Though only a few urban dwellers were unlucky enough to have jobs cleaning up animal waste from the streets, all farm men, and particularly teenage boys, had to confront the daily or weekly tasks of cleaning animal waste from stables, pig pens, and chicken coops. The hand labor, aided by only a few farm animals, focused on planting in the spring, cultivation in the summer, and harvesting in the fall. Turning feed grasses into hay took as much work as harvesting cash crops, such as corn or wheat. Cows needed attention when they gave birth, typically in the spring, and sheep were sheared in the spring. During the winter, farmers flailed grain, shelled corn, and cured tobacco. They repaired fences, tools, and harness, pulled stumps. In the north, farmers cut ice in the winter for sale or for summer use. Before mechanization had its effects in the last half of the 19th century, farmers were limited in the amount of land they could plant by low productivity and a limited time available to harvest. If the entire crop had to be harvested within 2 weeks, and it required 2 full days of hard labor to harvest a single acre, then a farmer could not plant more than 7 to 10 acres per available worker. Because farm laborers were hard to find, especially at harvest time, there was a clear incentive for farm families to have many children. Other solutions were to diversify into growing crops that matured at different times, spreading the harvesting season over as many weeks as possible, and to adopt mechanical equipment soon after it was invented. The mechanization of American agriculture, though lagging behind that of manufacturing, nevertheless outpaced Europe, for the wide open spaces of the American Midwest allowed ingenious inventors to find ways of lessening the human labor needed to grow a given output of crops. For millennia, farm work had been physically difficult, with long hours and constant strain on muscles. Gradually, during the 19th century, agriculture was transformed as motive power provided mainly by humans was gradually replaced by horses working with mechanical devices, and later, by the internal combustion engines that ultimately replaced the horse. There were few horses in agriculture before the 1830s and 1840s. It was the development of mechanical implements, starting with the metal plow, that made horses the essential source of power on the 19th century farm. Cast iron plows were replaced several decades later by steel plows that reduced the amount of power needed to pull the plow. A simple invention to reduce human drudgery was the sulky plow, which allowed the farmer to ride atop it instead of walking behind it. Soon plows were developed that could cut multiple rows at the same time. Several inventors, including Abid Hussey and Cyrus McCormick, share credit for the 1833-34 invention of the mechanical reaper, which could harvest more grain than could 5 men working with hand scythes. McCormick's initial model was a crude device that cut the standing grain and, with a revolving reel, swept it into a platform from which it was raked off into piles by a man walking alongside. By 1880, the bundles of grain were automatically bound with twine. All these reapers, though increasingly sophisticated, had to be pulled by a team or 2 or more horses, and improvements were constantly made to make them lighter and less taxing for horses to pull. In addition to other roles in pulling plows, reapers, and other moving machines, horses produced stationary power for threshing, corn shelling, grinding, baling, binding, and winnowing by means of the sweeps and treadmills, similar to those used to power horse ferries. The use of horses on the farm in the last 2/3 of the 19th century paralleled their increasing use as the prime movers of intra-urban transportation, as shown in Chapter 5. Mechanization of agriculture lagged behind that of manufacturing, in part because steam engines were too expensive and bulky to be purchased by individual farmers. Thus, the horse became dominant over the steam engine in farming and intra-urban transportation for the same reasons: its bulkiness and expense. Additional factors inside cities were noise that disturbed citizens and vibration that destroyed the streets. Unsolved until the arrival of the internal combustion engine was the problem of devising a self-propelled steam engine that could operate on soft, uneven ground without sinking in or tipping over. In other words, a self-propelled steam engine had to be like a horse. Though drought, heat, and insects were particular problems in the Great Plains, Even farmers in the most fertile areas of the Midwest within 200 miles of Chicago were suffering by the late 1880s. When they weren't protecting themselves and their animals from blizzards, they faced the consequences of growing indebtedness. Their increasing dependence on international commodity markets made the prices they received as unpredictable as the weather. Good weather and a bountiful harvest would cause oversupply and lower crop prices, whereas higher prices caused by growing demand would induce farmers farther west who lived on less fertile land to plant more and send prices down again. The situation was a severe instance of a chronic condition. Midwestern farmers lived on the edge in good times and bad. The image of the West in 20th century movies and television dramas was centered not on the yeoman farmer, but rather on the cowboy. Until the invention of the refrigerated railway car, cattle had to be driven directly to the city where they would be consumed. The main job of cowboys was to herd the cows while they were fattening up on the range, round them up, and then guide them in long cattle drives toward their destination. The roundup is central to the popular image of cowboy culture, yet depended on the open range before the invention of barbed wire fencing that allowed individual cattlemen to protect their rangeland from the intrusion of cows owned by others. Cowboys did not own cattle. They were employees of the cattlemen who owned the cattle. Their working conditions have been vividly described. After you have mastered the cow business thoroughly, that is, learned not to dread getting in mud up to your ears, jumping your horse into a swollen stream when the water is freezing, nor running your horse at full speed, trying to stop a stampeded herd on a dark night when your course has to be guided by the sound of the frightened steer's hooves. You command good wages, which will be from $25 to $60 per month. By 1915, many changes had occurred that mattered for the work life of farm families. Tractors began to ease the tasks of planting and cultivation for the farmers who could afford them, and combines came in small models. In 1935, 6.1 person-hours were required to harvest an acre of wheat, less than a third of the 20 that had been necessary in 1880. By 1940, one California wheat farmer underlined the change by observing, "We no longer raise wheat here, we manufacture it. We are not husbandmen, we are not farmers, we are producing a product to sell." Schools of agriculture and the research departments of seed companies made great strides in developing hybrid corn seeds that had greater yields and were more resistant to drought and insects. The percentage of all corn grown from hybrid seeds by 1940 had reached 24% nationwide and 77% in Iowa. This section has mainly been about farms in the Midwest and Great Plains states, and conditions there, however insecure and precarious, were orders of magnitude better than in the former Confederacy, where the sharecropping system developed, whereby ex-slaves in particular became tenant farmers. Indeed, tenant farming was much more common in the South than in the Midwest. In 1880, in the 8 core Midwestern states, the share of farms that were tenant-operated was 19.2, compared to a much higher 43.1 in the 6 states of the Deep South. By 1920, the disparity was even greater, at 28.9% versus 60.9% respectively. These percentages included both whites and blacks. The tenancy ratio for blacks in the South was roughly 75%. The sharecropping system differed from standard tenancy in that the landowner retained ownership of the buildings, tools, and possibly a mule, and hired the tenant and his family to do all the work needed to raise the crop, usually cotton. For his labor, the tenant would receive half of the income earned from the crop. Because the crop remained in the possession of the owner before a wage was paid, the arrangement amounted to making the tenant a wage laborer. Because the wage was not paid until after the crop was harvested, the sharecropper had to build up a debt to the owner to buy food and basic supplies. Because the debts often amounted to more than the value of the crop, the sharecroppers became, in effect, indentured servants. Life in the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly for the black sharecroppers, was striking in its isolation and its lack of connection to the modern world. Many members of farm families never traveled outside the county in which they were born. Roads were poor to non-existent, and the only means of travel available were by foot, horseback, or wagon. Striking was the absence of medium to large-sized cities that were typical in the Northeast and Midwest. Most towns were merely crossroads. Disease, heat, and danger, working conditions in non-farm America. The 1870 to 1940 period covered in Part 1 of this book encompasses the most rapid transition in American history from a largely rural to a predominantly urban nation. The percentage of the population living in urban areas, places having population greater than 2,500, grew from 25% in 1870 to 39% in 1900 to 57% in 1940. The population of urban America grew from 9.8 million in 1870 to 74.3 million in 1940, an increase of more than sevenfold. The population of towns and cities grew not just as immigrants arrived and chose urban life in preference to rural life, but also as a result of farm-to-city migration by farmers who had been driven off their farms by failed harvests, bad weather, foreclosure, bankruptcy, and/or a belief that an urban existence would provide higher wages, better leisure time activities, and less isolation. Next to agriculture, mining was the industry with the most taxing and dangerous working conditions. Though not subject to the vagaries of the weather or swarms of insects, mining had its own inherent perils for the large fraction of miners who worked underground rather than in open pits. Cave-ins could occur when support timbers gave way, and often were caused by carelessness in response to management orders for more output. The air was always humid. Explosions were a constant threat, for dust from the mining process could be ignited by the kerosene lamps that were the only form of illumination until the 1930s. Lung disease could be caused by the mining process of any mineral, but coal was unique in its ability to permanently disable coal miners with black lung disease. In the winter, miners could go for an entire week without seeing daylight, because they started their 10-hour shift before the sun rose and ended their shift after the sun set. Coal dust grinds itself into the skin, never to be removed. The miner must stoop as he works in the drift. He becomes bent like a gnome. His work is utterly fatiguing, muscles and bones ache. Close behind coal mining for abysmal working conditions were jobs in the great slaughterhouses of Chicago and elsewhere, also described in Chapter 7 in connection with Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle and the passage in 1906 of the Pure Food and Drug Act. From the moment workers entered the plants, they were assaulted by an unthinkable combination of odors, sights, and noises, including the squeals of animals. The Chicago establishments had developed the assembly line method of production even before Henry Ford's use of it in the auto industry. The work was not only disgusting, but also boring and tedious, and each worker would stand at the same position all day, doing the same scraping, slitting, or gutting maneuver. Worse yet, the number of hours worked fluctuated unpredictably from day to day. When they left home for work in the morning, slaughterhouse workers did not know whether they would be coming home at noon or at 9 p.m. Some of the extremes of long hours and difficult working conditions darkened the lives of the hapless laborers in the iron and steel industries. Conditions worsened in the 1880s as the 12-hour day replaced the 10-hour day, and work every other Sunday became common. As steel mills replaced ironworks, they had to operate continuously, and firms had enough control over the workers to insist on 2 daily 12-hour shifts instead of 3 daily 8-hour shifts. Hours per week ranged from 72 to 89, and continued so until a reform movement succeeded in having the 12-hour day abolished in 1923. An investigation conducted by the U.S. Bureau of Labor in 1910 found that nearly three-quarters of steelworkers were on a 12-hour schedule, and that on average, in that industry, laborers worked 72.6 hours per week. Competition between firms was cutthroat, and huge swings in the demand for steel made it imperative for managers to cut costs relentlessly if they were to survive. Only firms that had the lowest costs could stay in business when the price of a ton of steel dropped from $85 to $27 between the boom year of 1880 and the depressed market of 1885. The most important cost to make steel besides raw materials was labor, and firms worked ceaselessly to reduce labor requirements and, when possible, cut wages. The pace of work was intensified by foremen called pushers. A visiting English steelmaker reported on his return from America. The bosses drive the men to an extent that the employers would never dream of attempting in this country, getting the maximum work out of them. And the men do not seem to have the inclination or the power to resist the pressure. Another pair of British visitors, Karl Marx's daughter Eleanor Marx Aveling and her husband Edward, visited the United States in 1886. They found that the physical demands placed by American employers on their workers were much more severe than those prevailing in Britain. American laborers started to work at an earlier age than their British counterparts, worked more strenuously, and died, on the average, almost a decade earlier. They found fines for the mildest violations of rules, along with blacklists and intimidation. Many workers reported to the Avelings that they were afraid to be seen talking to them for fear of losing their jobs. Many employees were forced to sign an oath at hiring that they did not belong to and would not join any working-class organization. Not only were employees pressured to work at an unbearable pace, but their working conditions can only be described as insulting. There were no lockers for coats or packed lunches. Washrooms and toilets were few and insufficiently equipped, often lacking soap and toilet paper. Managers refused to put light bulbs in toilet rooms, hoping to discourage workers from reading instead of getting back to the job. Some factories had washing room attendants, whose main job was to clock the time the workers spent. Excessive time spent in the lavatory would result in a deduction from pay. Because there were no on-premises showers, mill workers covered with filth would spill into the streets at the end of their shift, leading to complaints from other people against whom they might rub. Before machinery replaced the task, men had to hammer red-hot iron into manageable pieces. A plant superintendent described this as an exceedingly hard and laborious job. They were working constantly in a cloud of moist vapor of high temperature, which of itself was debilitating. In the words of one steelworker, it was working a side of hell ahead of time. As machines replaced men, there was less need not only for laborers, but also for skilled craftsmen who had previously formed the metal in operations that required years of experience. The giant steel mills steadily replaced the skilled craftsmen with a homogeneous workforce of largely unskilled and semi-skilled workers. This trend from autonomous craftsmanship to a machine-driven, homogeneous working-class labor force was noticed in the Linz study. Inventions in technology continue rapidly to supplant muscle and the cunning hand of the master craftsman by batteries of tireless iron men doing narrowly specialized things over and over and merely operated or tended in their orderly, clangorous, repetitive processes by the human worker. The role of mechanization in driving upward productivity in the manufacturing sector is illustrated by Figure 8.6. Shown for selected intervals between 1869 and 1929 are the annual growth rate of horsepower per hour worked and output per hour worked. Though the correlation is not perfect across these time periods, we notice that in 1869 to 89, the two series increased together, whereas in 1889 to 1914, horsepower per person grew exactly twice as fast as output per worker. After a short hiatus of slow growth during 1914 to 19, growth in both horsepower and output per hour soared in the early 1920s and concluded the 1920s with slower but still rapid growth. The explosion of productivity growth in manufacturing during the 1920s has long been noticed by economic historians. Paul David has argued that half of the upsurge in manufacturing productivity after 1919 can be attributed to growth in electric motor capacity. Among the reasons cited by David for the long delay in the electrification of manufacturing was the high price of electricity, as well as the time taken to develop small electric motors powerful enough to replace the previous system of shafts and belts, linking individual workstations with a centralized steam or water power source. David cites as a byproduct of the transition to single-unit electric machines an improvement in working conditions. Lighter, cleaner workshops were made possible by the introduction of skylights, where formerly overhead transmission apparatus had been mounted, and also by the elimination of the myriad strands of rotating belting that previously swirled dust and grease through the factory atmosphere, and where unenclosed within safety screening, threatened to maim or kill workers who became caught up in them. The industrial dead and wounded, fatalities, injuries, and frequent unemployment. Coal mining deaths occurred at a rate of 1 or 2 per day in the late 19th century. Accidents came from roof collapses, runaway coal buggies, flooding, and faulty explosives. In 1930, injuries from coal mining per hour worked were almost 5 times higher than in manufacturing. Coal miners were not alone. For all industrial blue-collar workers, life in the workplace was dangerous. During the year ending June 1907, in Allegheny County, which includes Pittsburgh, there were 526 accidental deaths of workers in the county's factories, mines, and railroad yards. In addition, 167 workers were disabled. Deaths from industrial accidents in Pittsburgh per 100,000 residents almost doubled from 123 to 214 between 1870 and 1900. The Linds surveyed their working-class families in 1925 and found that 1 in 5 workers had an accident in 1923 serious enough to create an absence and hence loss of income. More than half lost fewer than 8 days, but 29% lost 3 weeks or longer. The death rate came out at 50 per 100,000 workers. The most dangerous industry was iron and steel production. Molten metal spattered the mill hands. Unstable piles of iron billets stood everywhere. Hot floors burned feet through wooden-soled shoes. Molds and furnaces exploded. The machinery had no protective guards. Standing next to a hot furnace all day, stirring iron, guiding it through the rolls, carrying it, dumping materials into blast furnaces, and pouring steel into molds drained workers, especially during the summer, when the mills resembled infernos. Those who chose to escape the stifling mills or stinking slaughterhouses often chose construction work, despite its unpredictable and seasonal ups and downs in labor demand. But construction workers faced their own set of dangers. They could be injured in falls, or crushed to death, or maimed by heavy construction materials that dropped or became dislodged. Outdoor workers in railroad yards were killed by moving trains, often at night, and immigrants who had poor language skills were particularly prone to injuries, for they did not understand warning signs or signals. The legal protection of injured workers or compensation of their families in the case of death barely existed. The courts ruled in the late 19th century that those who accepted employment in the steel, coal, railroad, or laundry industries assumed the risk of dangers that were widely known. Carelessness on the part of fellow employees leading to injury or death was not considered the employer's responsibility. Managers often blamed industrial accidents on employees' carelessness and drinking. Though garment making might seem a safe occupation, particularly when contrasted with laboring in a steel mill or coal mine, conditions in the industry were not pleasant. The female immigrant workers who dominated work in the apparel industry, in addition to receiving low wages and working long hours, suffered from unsafe working conditions. Needles could pierce fingers and sometimes require finger amputations. Workers were typically locked in the rooms. Perhaps the best-known disaster in U.S. manufacturing history was the New York City Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in March 1911, in which 148 employees died, most of them young women, in conditions very similar to those of the Bangladesh clothing factory fires of 2012-13. As flames spread throughout the 8th floor, workers jumped to their deaths. Scores of charred bodies were found piled against closed doors. They had been kept bolted, a newspaper reported, to safeguard employers from the loss of goods by the departure of workers. There were fire escapes, but they could not handle the 700 fleeing workers. Women whose clothes and hair were on fire leaped to their deaths. This tragic event caught the nation's attention and led to reforms and regulations to improve workplace safety. As difficult as work may have been in the late 19th century, men had to work to provide an income for their families. But they could not always work as much as they wanted, for the economy was subject to repeated booms and busts. There was a severe depression between 1873 and 1878, and another between 1893 and 1897, with shorter downturns in the mid-1880s and after the financial crisis of 1907. Between the 1907 panic and mid-1909, fully half of the 40,000 blast furnace workers in the steel industry lost their jobs. In 1880, a relatively prosperous year, 30% of all Pittsburgh working-class men experienced unemployment lasting longer than a month. Uncertainty was widespread, not just about next year's financial situation, but also about next week's income. Workers sometimes reported for work only to find the plant or mill closed or their jobs eliminated. Firms were under no obligation to provide advance notification of termination or to provide severance pay. Layoffs could stretch from a day to a week or even several months. Instability of aggregate demand first hit the traditionally cyclical industries such as construction and steel, but soon extended into the service sector. When automobile sales fell, not only were automobile production workers laid off, but so were car salespeople at automobile dealers. At the very end of the 1870 to 1940 period, covered in Part 1 of this book, the blow to family income from unemployment was partially cushioned by government-managed unemployment benefits, financed at the federal government level. Before the 1938 New Deal legislation, workers' compensation, WC, was handled entirely at the state level. During the decade between 1910 and 1920, all but 4 of the 48 states had passed WC legislation. Before then, unemployed heads of households had only their previous savings, if any, and private charity to provide food and shelter for their families, with help in summer, in the less congested cities, from vegetable gardens. There was little sympathy in the middle and upper classes, among whom unemployment was rare, for the effects of income variability in working-class families. In the middle and upper classes, workers were blamed for their troubles and portrayed as dullards or as dangerous, drunken louts. Women's work outside the home, occupational segregation, low wages, and repetitive tasks. Paid work was much less common among married women than unmarried before World War II. Unmarried women were herded into women's jobs, including household servants, clerks, school teachers, and medical nurses. Women worked also in manufacturing, primarily in textiles and apparel. The majority of these working women were young, childless, and/or widows. Just as the mechanization of the steel industry eliminated the personal satisfaction of skilled workers and forced employees into a homogeneous and highly regimented workforce, so the invention of the sewing machine created the archetypal sweatshop. in which rows and rows of women sat in front of their machines, producing clothing to the drumbeat of their supervisors' demands for an ever faster pace of work. The harsh conditions present in 1870, before the arrival of the sewing machine, combined poor working conditions and low pay. I have worked from dawn to sundown, not stopping to get one mouthful of food for 25 cents. I've lived on one cracker a day when I could not find work, traveling from place to place in pursuit of it, made shirts for 8 cents apiece, and by working early and late could make 3 in a day. Though most women did not work in the late 19th and early 20th century, those who did experienced a severe disappointment if they thought that work outside the home would be easier, more pleasant, or less isolating than work inside the home. Indeed, the conditions for female workers turned out to be even worse than those for men in most occupations. Women were unskilled, unorganized into any unions or other supportive groups, and crowded into a few occupations where their wages were low and their working conditions, in some cases, appalling. Firms preferred to hire women, for women were docile, cared most about their families, had little expectation of advancement, and posed no likelihood of joining a trade union or other form of protest. Most important, as machinery reduced the physical demands of work in many manufacturing industries, employers found that women could do the same work and were willing to accept a lower rate of pay. For instance, machinery changed the nature of work at shoe factories and raised the share of female employees from 5% in 1870 to nearly 25% in 1910. Many women in the workforce shared the experience of blue-collar males in finding that their jobs became more routinized and less compatible with individual initiative. An example was the elimination of previously independent midwives, as the male-dominated American Medical Association forced the birth process from home to hospital and virtually abolished midwifery. Female librarians, nurses, and teachers all became subject to supervision by male supervisors. But there was improvement in the situation of women as well. By the 1920s, an advance guard of females began to make their first tentative advances into management and the professions, taking jobs as college professors and presidents, chemists, photographers, dentists, manufacturers, and supervisors. Less affluent native-born white women entered secretarial and office work, finding places for themselves in this new and expanding sector of the workforce. Part of the increase in the female participation rate from 1920 to 1940 resulted from the increased demand for clerical workers in response to the steady decline in the output share of agriculture and increased share of the service sector. Another part was a response to the great surge of secondary school attendance and graduation. High school graduation rates increased from 9% in 1910 to 52% in 1940. A third cause was the gradual diffusion of electric appliances, as discussed in Chapter 4, including the iron, vacuum cleaner, range, refrigerator, and washing machine. The opportunities for women to shift from household service and the apparel sweatshop to clerical and sales work steadily improved working conditions as dirty and arduous work was replaced by the cleaner and more comfortable environment of the modern office and sales floor, jobs that typically required fewer hours of work per week. The female fate inside the home, isolation and all that laundry. The life of a working-class housewife in the late 19th century was little different than that of a hired domestic servant. Marriage brings a woman a life sentence of hard labor in her home. Her work is the most monotonous in the world, and she has no escape from it. A child raised on a North Dakota farm in the 1890s later recalled as a grandmother details of life inside her late 19th century farmhouse. She remembers the tools, doing laundry with tubs, washboards, and flat irons, cooking on a wood stove with iron pots, growing and preserving food, sewing and mending, cleaning filthy kerosene lamps, and speaks with a little nostalgia. "I'd hate to go through it again. Took us all day to do a big washing." During the interview, she guessed that electric lights arrived in her farmhouse around 1923, sooner than for most families, who had to wait until the 1930s and 1940s to join the modern world of electricity. Aside from the major invention of the cast-iron stove and the minor invention of the hand egg beater, the process of cooking was roughly the same in 1900 as a century earlier. The kitchen was the center of family life, and often was the only room supplied with heat. There were bread and cakes to be baked from batter mixed by hand, vegetable chopping to be done with no Cuisinart to help, the fire to be fed. In cooking, as in other household tasks, women still did the work of producing energy in 1900. Their daughters would come to consume it. The monotonous routine of the housewife was little changed from week to week. Only grave sickness or sudden calamity broke that proper routine. Washing on Monday, ironing on Tuesday, mending on Wednesday, sewing on Thursday, extra cleaning on Friday, baking on Saturday. The burden of weekly laundry was the most onerous task. In most of rural America until the 1940s, wash day started with carrying in enough water to fill a large pot and heat it on a coal or wood stove, then rubbing clothes on a washboard, turning a hand wringer, and then hanging clothes on a clothesline. When one needed to draw water, chop wood to heat it, scrub each item by hand, rinse in clean water, and then clean the ashes after. It was little wonder that those who could afford to often employed laundresses. As incomes rose, some could afford to use commercial laundries, whose revenues doubled between 1919 and 1929. A household task even more unpleasant than doing the laundry was, before the arrival of underground sewer pipes, the need to carry liquid refuse outside, including dirty dishwater, cooking slops, and of course, the contents of chamber pots. Clean water and the elimination of untreated outdoor waste not only freed women from their previous role as beasts of burden, but also was the most important of all factors that created the epical conquest of infant mortality during the interval of 1890 and 1950. Nevertheless, in 1940, 33% of all homes still cooked with wood or coal, 20% still lacked electric light, 30% lacked running water, 40% lacked an indoor toilet, 44% lacked a private shower or bathtub, and 58% lacked central heating. How much did the arrival of running water, sewers, and household appliances reduce the work effort of women at home? One estimate comes from the Linds survey of 120 working-class families in 1925, in which 2/3 of the responses reported that the wives worked between 4 and 7 hours per day. The average of roughly 6 hours per day for 7 days each week comes to about 42 hours per week, somewhat less than the 48 to 50 hours per week that men were working at the same time. 3/4 of those responding reported that their mothers worked more hours, but the survey results do not indicate by how much. A more significant change was found in the same survey for 40 business-class housewives, who reported that 1/3 had one full-time household servant, whereas the proportion of their 1890 mothers was 2/3. The shift from full-time servants to a weekly visit was attributed to cost. A single day's labor of this sort today costs approximately what the housewife's mother paid for a week's work. A more systematic approach to the division of the work week into types of activities has been developed by Valerie Ramey and Neville Francis. They divide the total hours per week spent by both men and women among 4 main activities: market work, household production, leisure time, and personal care time, the latter category including sleeping, bathing, and eating. Their definition of leisure relies on modern household surveys of how enjoyable an activity is rated. Surprisingly, on a scale of 1 to 10, work rates a level of enjoyment of 7. We note that this high ranking of the enjoyment obtained from work describes surveys taken in the 1990s, not the 1890s, and that work has become much less unpleasant, and hence more enjoyable over that century. Based on the survey rating of the enjoyment obtained from many activities, the types of activities classified as leisure, that is, more enjoyable than market work, include sports, playing with children, hanging out in bars, movies, reading, walking, meals out, recreational trips, hobbies, baby care, exercise, and gardening. Categories classified as household production because they are less enjoyable than market work include cooking, shopping, child and elderly care, commuting, errands, housework, home repairs, paying bills, yard work, cleaning the home and dishes, laundry, and going to the doctor, dentist, or automobile repair shop. Ramey and Francis have developed estimates for the entire 20th century of time use divided among the 4 basic activities of market work, home production, leisure time, and personal care. Their key result comes from a separate paper by Ramey and finds that the prime age group of 25 to 54-year-olds experienced only a slight reduction in hours devoted to home production, from 26 hours per week in 1900 to 24.3 hours in 2005, despite the arrival of all the consumer appliances that would have seemed wondrous to behold from the perspective of 1900. The paradox is resolved when we learn that prime-age women actually did benefit from consumer appliances, reducing their weekly hours of home production from 50.4 in 1900 to a mere 31.1 in 2005. While men in the same age groups raised their weekly hours in home production from 3.7 to 17.3. The Ramey-Francis estimate for age 18 to 64 female home production time for 1925 is 43.8 hours per week, very close to the 42-hour rough estimate obtained from the Linns survey already discussed. The 20th century transition combined 2 different trends: the alleviation of the burden of housework experienced by women, together with the decline of market work hours of men, which allowed them to participate more actively in home production, including child care, home repairs, and yard work. The increased activity of men reflected, in part, a transition in residential location from farming, where outdoor maintenance was counted as hours of work, to suburban dads mowing their lawns and fixing up their houses. The transition from inner-city tenements to suburban settings also raised the ratio of land to family size and required more male maintenance. The Ramey result, that hours in household production hardly changed, with an increase in male hours nearly canceling the decline in female hours, looks very different when hours per person are converted to hours per household. On this basis, the data make more sense, with a decline in home production hours per household, including teenagers, women, men, and individuals aged 65 or older, from 78 to 49 hours per week between 1900 and 2005. Though the average size of households declined by almost the same percentage during that period, from 4.7 persons to 2.6 persons, any attempt to conclude that hours per person of household production did not decline ignores the basic economies of scale of household production. Once the housewife has to produce breakfast or dinner for the family, it makes little difference whether she is cooking for 2 or 4 children. The apparent paradox that the development of consumer appliances did not appreciably reduce time devoted to home production has an explanation, provided by the Linns 1925 survey. Respondents reported that though the physical toil of housework had declined, this had been offset by rising standards. People are more particular about diet today. They care more about having things nicely served and dressing for dinner. So many things our mothers didn't know about we feel that we ought to do for our children. Joel Mokyr has labeled this conundrum, that the invention and diffusion of consumer electric appliances did not reduce hours of household production, as the Ruth Schwartz Cohen problem. His analysis is in the same spirit as the Linns observation, but goes much further in linking it to the late 19th century Pasteur germ theory of disease and the resulting increase in standards of cleanliness, requiring that more hours be spent not only in cleaning the house, but also in bathing children. Health was now viewed not as an inevitable divine retribution, but as a matter of personal responsibility. Did progress boost real wages? Skilled workers, such as molders, carpenters, machinists, mule spinners, and coal miners, represented about 45% of blue-collar workers around 1900, and could barely afford to keep their families above a standard of living that we would associate with poverty. There would have been plenty of food on the table, but their well-being was always at risk, a potential victim of unemployment, illness, or injury. Workers were paid hourly wages, and they had to show up to collect the wages. There was no sympathy in late 19th century industrial America for workers who experienced bad luck. These workers were discarded, and there were plenty of eager applicants at the door, often just off the ship from Europe. Above the level of the semi-skilled were the aristocracy of the working class, the highly skilled and irreplaceable workers, including many iron rollers, locomotive engineers, pattern makers, and glassblowers. The highest income manual workers at the turn of the century could earn incomes of $800 to $1,100 yearly. At the bottom were about a quarter of the working class who lived in total destitution. Many found their living by scavenging, begging, and hustling. Peter Shergold's careful study of 22 occupations in Pittsburgh, both in manufacturing and construction, in 1906, shows a 2-to-1 difference in the hourly wages of the most skilled workers, for example bricklayers, to the least skilled, common laborers. His results reinforce the view that it is simplistic to consider the American working class at the turn of the last century as a homogeneous, struggling horde. There were two worlds among Pittsburgh's manual workers. At the top of the wage pyramid were those highly skilled, high-income workers able to purchase their own homes, to wash in indoor bathrooms, families able to enjoy the American standard. At the broad base of the pyramid was the city's large laboring population, crowded into hastily converted tenements and rapidly deteriorating wooden constructs, sharing outside toilet facilities and a communal faucet, living next to the noise, glare, and stench of the mills and furnaces. Here were children fighting imaginary battles along the unpaved streets and open sewers, and workers to whom leisure was sleep. By 1914, the average nominal manufacturing wage had increased by 30%, from 17 cents per hour to 22 cents per hour, which translated to $2.04 per day. Consider the sensation created when Henry Ford announced early in 1914 that henceforth the base wage in his Highland Park factory would be $5 per day. His ulterior motive was to reduce labor turnover, combined with a bit of altruism. Labor turnover was an endemic problem at the time, due in part to the reliance of manufacturing plants on immigrant workers who were not yet married and planned to move on to another town whenever news came of better wages or working conditions. For instance, the superintendent of a mine in western Pennsylvania alleged that he had hired 5,000 workers in a single year to sustain his desired workforce of 1,000. The fact that unskilled work in manufacturing plants required little or no training made it easy for immigrant workers who were dissatisfied with one type of work to quit and move to another town and try something different. Ford more than doubled the wage, but the generosity did not come without conditions, for he combined altruism with paternalism. His newly formed sociological department hired 200 agents to visit every household of the 13,000 employees and provide them with advice about a proper lifestyle. Because Ford required employees to be married, a purpose of the agents' home visits was not just to observe standards of cleanliness, but also to make sure that there was a wife. Single male employees often borrowed young, unattached women to play act the role of wives during these visits. The paternalism crept into every aspect of life. Ford provided legal staff to help workers buy houses, had a medical team of 10 doctors and 100 nurses to provide health care, especially to injured workers, and arranged for language training of immigrants. But there was no toleration for the non-American customs of immigrant workers, and 100 of them were fired for taking a day off from work to celebrate the Eastern Orthodox Christmas. The reformer Ida Tarbell visited the community, planning to expose the oppressive Ford system, yet concluded, "I don't care what you call it, philanthropy, paternalism, autocracy. The results which are being obtained are worth all you can set against them." A broader historical view of real wages is provided in Figure 8.7, which plots real wages of production, non-supervisory workers against real GDP per hour, both expressed as index numbers, with 1940 equal to 100. The most striking aspect of the graph is that real wages grew faster than output per hour, i.e., labor productivity, before 1940, but more slowly thereafter, particularly after 1980. The post-1980 divergence is consistent with the large literature on increasing inequality and the declining income share of labor, with a large share of productivity gains after 1980 going to the top 1% of the income distribution. More puzzling is the rapid growth of real wages relative to productivity before 1940, with a particular surge in real wages between 1920 and 1940, despite the decline in labor demand experienced during the decade of the Great Depression. Growth rates over intervals are plotted separately in Figure 8.8. The results are quite striking. Over the 7 decades between 1870 and 1940, the real wage grew almost a full percentage point faster than productivity, 2.48 versus 1.51% per year. But after 1940, the relationship was reversed, with productivity growth of 2.25% outpacing real wage growth of 1.56% by a difference of 0.69 percentage points. The time interval with the fastest real wage growth was 1910 to 40, when the growth rate of 3.08% was a full percentage point faster than during 1870 to 1910. A plausible explanation for this shift was the role of unlimited immigration in holding down real wages in the earlier period and the end of mass immigration caused by World War I and the restrictive anti-immigration quotas passed in 1921, which saw further tightening in 1924 and 1929. The encouragement of labor unions by New Deal legislation may have been just as important, as suggested by the extremely rapid 4.64 annual growth rate of the real wage series between 1936 and 1940. Some part of the explanation of rapid real wage increases before 1940, particularly between 1920 and 1940, may be attributable to the end of mass immigration and the encouragement of labor unions by New Deal legislation. But ultimately, it was technological change that drove real wages higher. Part of this was compositional. New machines that pulled, pushed, carried, and lifted shifted the composition of employment away from the common laborer to operatives doing specialized, albeit repetitive tasks, and to new layers of supervisors, engineers, and repairmen to plan the layout of the machines, train new workers, and tend the machines. Firms began to raise pay to reduce turnover, for the assembly line could be slowed if an experienced worker quit and was replaced by someone who could not initially keep pace. Much of this shift in the nature of employment was created by the rise of the automobile industry and its assembly line method of production, and is symbolized by the contrast between the dark, satanic steel mills of the 1870s and the smoothly running Ford and General Motors assembly lines of the 1920s. The opportunity cost of education was child labor. As we learn from Figure 8.2, child labor was common before 1920, especially for boys aged 14 to 15, whose participation rate in 1870 was 50%. Farmers started their children doing simple chores, such as collecting eggs at age 5 or 6. Family businesses, such as restaurants, also started children working very young. I started washing dishes in the restaurant about 5. I'd get up on a Coca-Cola box to bend over the dish, though, later recalled a child laborer. Textile mills hired children deliberately because they could duck in and out of small spaces between the machines. Children between the ages of 10 and 15 regularly lied about their ages in order to gain employment, often encouraged by parents who needed the extra income to fill holes in the family budget. Full-time young workers had shifts of between 8 and 12 hours. There were a well-recognized group of boys' jobs. In coal mines, boys as young as 8 worked as trappers, opening and closing doors so that coal cars could move through underground passages. Breaker boys picked through mined coal and threw out the slag. In manufacturing, boys cut cold iron into strips, opened and closed furnace doors, and opened and closed the molds for skilled glassblowers. Boys, like adult women, were typically paid half the hourly rate of adult men, between 75 cents and $1.25 per day. Though most states in the North had compulsory school attendance and child labor laws by 1890, they were only erratically enforced. Southern states deliberately did not pass similar legislation in hopes of obtaining a competitive advantage over northern textile plants. But in both the North and the South, children of textile workers went immediately from school to work in textile mills. For the 14 to 15 age group, 76% of textile workers' children in the Northeast and 94% of children in 4 southern states were at work. Inequality was transmitted between generations by the tendency of relatively high-income parents to keep their children in school longer, as contrasted with immediate labor force entry by children from lower-income families as soon as compulsory school ended. Farm families tended to keep their children in school longer than blue-collar workers in the cities, for there was no extra monetary compensation for the family when farm teenagers quit school to work. Just as farm teenagers had more freedom than their urban counterparts, so the life of teenage boys in small towns offered more leisure and less toil, as experienced by Tom Sawyer and other young heroes of small-town novels. Sinclair Lewis wrote nostalgically of his own fun he had as a kid, swimming and fishing in Sauk Lake or cruising its perilous depths on a raft, tramping out to the ferry lake for a picnic. It was a good time, a good place, and a good preparation for life. For boys living in small towns, the country was necessarily always nearby. Country roads beckoned the town boy to fish, to hunt, or simply to tramp the woods looking for excitement. The country road with barefoot boys, dogs, and fishing poles was an important part of early 20th century small-town iconography. This life could not have been more different from that of the child laborers, who were victims of their industrial environment. The opportunity cost of extra education is a central concept that explains the differential education attainment in different locations and social classes. The opportunity cost was highest in urban manufacturing centers, where the choice of working in manufacturing or garment sweatshops precluded further schooling entirely. The opportunity cost for rural teenagers was much lower, for they were expected to help with the planting in the spring and harvest in the early fall, and were allowed and expected to attend school on a seasonal basis. Indeed, among the highest high school graduation rates across states were in the portions of the Midwest that Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz called the Education Belt. In 1910, the highest rates of high school graduation outside the New England states were in Iowa, Indiana, and Nebraska. All of the North Central states ranked higher than any of the Mid-Atlantic states. In 1910, High school completion rates in New York and New Jersey were in the same category as the states of the old Confederacy. By 1870, most children in the North and West were literate and had completed elementary school. But in 1876, the total number of high school graduates was only 20,000 per year in a population of 45 million. The ratio of high school attendance to elementary school attendance was only 6%. Only 1% of the college-age population was enrolled in institutions of higher learning in 1870. The years 1910 to 1940 witnessed the most rapid phase of expansion of secondary education, as shown in Figure 8.9. Though in 1910, just 9% of American teenagers obtained a high school diploma, by 1940 that percentage had reached 51%, and by 1970 it had reached 76.9%. The completion rate rose by 14 percentage points per decade during 1910 to 40, by 8.7 points per decade during 1940 to 70, and not at all after 1970. The surge in secondary school attendance and completion made possible the rapid expansion of college enrollment after World War II. Conclusion. A consistent theme of this book has been that the world was revolutionized among multiple dimensions between 1870 and 1940. In every chapter, we continue to discover aspects of ordinary life that were unalterably changed between 1870 and 1940, and most of these happened over the shorter interval between 1890 and 1930. Previous chapters have shown how the world was changed by electrification, the networking of the home, motor vehicles, communication, entertainment, and the eradication of not just infant mortality, but also most infectious diseases. Life had irreversibly improved along so many dimensions. By 1930, urban America enjoyed near-complete coverage with electric power, running water, sewer lines, telephone access, and town or natural gas, not to mention the nearly total replacement of the horse by the motor vehicle. This chapter adds to the multi-dimensional list of improvements achieved during 1890 to 1930. These 40 years were an era of improvement without comparison in human history, when hours of work per week were reduced, when the danger and physical difficulty of work began its long transition to more pleasant and comfortable work, when the exploitation of children in mines and factories was replaced by quiet high school classrooms, and when the taxing drudgery of household work for women was greatly lessened by running water, sewer pipes, and the first appearance of electric appliances. The Great Depression and World War II interrupted progress along these dimensions, but in the 25 years after the war, the benefits spread to the entire population. The declining disutility, or unpleasantness, of work occurred across 3 dimensions. Most clearly, weekly hours of work declined sharply from roughly 60 hours per week in 1890 to 40 in 1940. In some extreme cases, as in the iron and steel industry, weekly hours had been 72 per week or more during 1890 to 1910. The second dimension was the shift in the occupational distribution away from back-breaking, uncomfortable, and dangerous work toward less unpleasant jobs, including as assembly line operatives and white-collar clerks. The third dimension was the most important and is the central focus of the chapter, for it describes the epochal transition from the taxing and arduous working conditions within each occupational group of 1870 to 1900, in contrast with the steady improvements in these working conditions after 1910. A sharp distinction is drawn between the working conditions of the 46% of the 1870 workforce engaged in farming as proprietors or farm laborers, and the 46% working in blue-collar or white-collar occupations. The remaining 8% worked as non-farm proprietors, managers, or professionals. The majority of those engaged in farming were proprietors who owned their own land and homes, usually subject to mortgages and debt. They had the great advantage over urban workers of being independent. There was no boss who dictated their working hours or behavior, or who could dismiss them at a whim. Rather, the farmer answered to the combined bosses of weather, insects, and farm prices. The vagaries of the weather, the unpredictable clouds of insects, and the equally unpredictable risk of plunging farm prices made each farmer's existence not only physically taxing, but also economically risky. And whatever the hazards of being a farmer in the Midwest and Great Plains, nothing compared to the indignity and economic exploitation of the southern black sharecroppers. This chapter replaces one's vague idea that work was tough in the old days, with the visceral daily pain and humiliation of being a blue-collar worker in America in the late 19th century. The danger of coal mining and the disgusting conditions of the stockyards were matched by the cruel conditions to which workers in the iron and steel industries were subjected by the tough policies of bosses, such as Andrew Carnegie, now remembered benignly for his contributions to museums and public libraries. Shifts were 12 hours per day, in conditions lacking lockers and having only primitive toilet facilities, and the heat and danger of the job itself paints a portrait of dramatic imbalance between the power of employers and the weakness of workers. Managers could dismiss workers instantly, for any reason, including a perception that, as a worker aged, he or she was becoming physically weaker. The number of hours worked per year varied randomly, not just with the business cycle, but also when any closure for maintenance, reconstruction, or slack demand sent workers onto the streets with no compensation and no unemployment insurance. Women faced a life of hard work, boredom, and drudgery, whether on the farm or in the city. The small percentage of women who entered the labor market found themselves cordoned off into female occupations, working to manufacture apparel or as clerks, nurses, or school teachers. They were usually paid half of male wages. Employment in the market was more common for younger women who had not yet married, and this employment was primarily in domestic service, which occupied fully 8% of the labor force. This world of upstairs, downstairs, and Downton Abbey created for many women jobs that were not dangerous as male blue-collar jobs, but shared with them the unforgiving discipline of fixed and long hours of work and daily rites of subservience. The chapter traces how working conditions improved over time along multiple dimensions. The share of farm workers declined, hours of manufacturing workers declined, and workforce discipline became less tyrannical as workers protested and as the endless supply of immigrants was cut off by restrictive quotas in the early 1920s. The daily ordeal of housewives in managing their homes was made less burdensome by a series of innovations, including running water and sewer pipes, the cast iron stove, and then the many goods available from the mail-order catalogs after 1895. Especially the major electric consumer durables that became available after 1920, including the electric washing machine and refrigerator. This chapter broadens the scope of the American standard of living. Households cared not just about how much they could buy and how easy it was to convert market-purchased goods into household-produced meals. The male bread earners cared deeply about the difficulty of the task of earning a living. Long hours and autocratic discipline gradually transitioned into shorter hours and more respect for employees. The grandchildren of the valiant and brutalized farmers, coal miners, and manufacturing workers of the 1870s and 1880s did not realize how lucky they were to be working in 1940. The conditions of work both outside of and inside of the home had finally changed for the better after centuries and millennia of agricultural peasantry. Changes in the occupational distribution and the arduousness of work within a given occupation continued well beyond 1940. But the decline in working hours from 60 hours weekly to the normal post-war 40-hour week was fully accomplished by 1940. In that sense, The improvements in the welfare of workers, chronicled in this chapter, represent yet another dimension of the unique achievement of the years 1870 to 1940. No other era in human history, either before or since, combined so many elements in which the standard of living increased as quickly and in which the human condition was transformed so completely.
Please subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss another update.